Hello and welcome to a very special edition of the Fitz News Live Month in Review. I'm Dylan Nolan, your host, joined by Andrew Fancher and Callie Lyons. You're in for a special show as we, the inmates, are running the asylum. Our founding editor, Will Folks, and research director Jennifer Wood are out of pocket this afternoon, but do not fear, we've got plenty to talk about. Andrew wrote our number one story this month. He has been chronicling the saga of Spartanburg County Sheriff Chuck Wright, who has recently fallen under federal investigation. And Callie, you've been carrying the torch for months at this point on a number of true crime stories that continue to develop, including the Micah Miller saga, which this month celebrated 1 year of Micah's passing. But we continue to see developments in that case, as well as a number of other true crime cases. And of course, on my end, Palmetto politics never sleeps, but particularly when the General Assembly is in session, as we are approaching the end of the spring 2025 session, there have been some fireworks as, in an unprecedented move, the state Senate moved to remove the elected state treasurer. So we're going to touch on that as well. But of course, we're going to begin our show with Chuck Wright. Andrew, take it away.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, may God help us all as you emphasize the inmates are running the asylum. Um, in Spartanburg County, I think in our last weekend review segment, I kicked off by saying it ain't easy being wrong and it ain't easy being Chuck Wright. That line rings true, especially today, for we just kicked out a report earlier this week. And I'm saying we because it didn't only take Fitz News, but it took a panel of law enforcement officers with various backgrounds to make this report possible. A report that I've seen has not come without some contention. Headline being Sheriff Missing Amid Federal Probe Armed with Fully Automatic Weapons and SWAT Gear. Um, it sounds sensational, but it's true. Um, when your constituents don't know where you are, Chuck Wright, when members of your own department claim you are in possession of fully automatic weapons, when members of your own department say that you're harboring thousands of dollars worth of SWAT gear, I would say that rises to a level of something worth reporting. In our latest installment on Sheriff Chuck Wright, who has been the longstanding uber Christian sheriff since 2004. Well, then there was a runoff, so 2005 to present. He is a fellow who has incorporated scripture into every press conference, as well as Bible studies. And there's at least one instance of him founding his own church, which his wife appears to be in the register of deeds on. Um, this case, at least what we're looking at, which might be totally different from where the feds are digging right now, because he is under a federal investigation of no publicly known origin. It has no bottom. Usually with rabbit holes, and Callie, you and I were just talking about how exciting rabbit holes are. Um, this is a rabbit hole without a brick wall. Just when you think you've gone as deep as you could possibly go into the bottomless pit of Spartanburg, um, you find another individual who points you in another direction, and it takes you even deeper. Um, I am elated by some of the things that we have already been able to substantiate, and I know I'm being vague, but we have got a whole lot prepared based off of what these former as well as active law enforcement officers are sharing with us. I mean, when you're under a federal investigation and now your entire law enforcement career is under scrutiny, those skeletons may quite literally float to the surface. And I'm I'm interested to see where it goes from here because I don't know where it ends.
Now, Andrew, you've been following the sheriff for months at this point, and there's a lot of law enforcement officials where you follow them very closely and find some pretty damning stuff. But this is one of the first cases where we've seen a serious interest in this by law enforcement officials, federal law enforcement officials in this case. Before this big break, you were set to, kind of go out and issue Andrew's opinion on Sheriff Chuck Wright. But it seems as though that's almost a moot point at this point because, you have the federal judiciary that's going to be stepping into that role.
I had considered, and Will Folks, thank God, he turned down an op-ed I had proposed, "Coward of the County." So thank God again, I did not write "Coward of the County," because this was before. I'll make another Titanic reference. The music on the Titanic stopped. Um, Chuck Wright appears to have pretty much kept his hand patched on a heavily reinforced dam. And once he stepped away on April Fool's Day of all days to enter a leave of absence, that dam broke. His entire county flooded, and the sheriff is nowhere to be seen, nowhere to be accounted for. I mean, obviously, some people know where the king of the county is, but when we're paying him, we taxpayers are paying him approximately $3,800 a week. When he refuses to answer his emails regarding missing firearms, included but not limited to a pre-ban H&K MP5 from the evidence room, which
A
we
little
emailed.
jealous.
Hey, I told this to a deputy recently. I can't say he doesn't have good taste. Um, when you have the county credit card and you have no qualms putting anything and everything on it, included but not limited to a full bed truck gun safe, which he attempted to upgrade purportedly in the months leading up to his leave of absence. I mean, hell, the sheriff, who again is making a six-figure salary, uh, when he purchases a $73,000 2024 King Ranch, because the Tahoe he used to drive wasn't comfortable. That's not an exact quote, but I'm paraphrasing. A Tahoe with approximately 28,000 miles on it, just to get a 2024 King Ranch, which he outfitted with a full bed truck gun safe. And then he attempts to upgrade that truck gun safe, not for functionality, but because he liked a newer model. It makes you wonder what's going on in Spartanburg. And I I was talking to a fella who the media is very familiar with out there, and I asked him, where is the outrage? And he said the outrage will come with information, but unfortunately, the FOCs, as the lawmen out that way call it, the Friends of Chuck, um, they don't seem too interested in information on their sheriff. Now, obviously, this is becoming a more and more normal conversation, especially considering that, again, the dam has broke, the sheriff is unaccounted for, and we've got firearms purportedly missing, we've got SWAT gear purportedly missing, and we have got a flood of information coming in regarding the entirety of his career. Um, some people may say that we're picking at straws looking at some of these elements of what he committed during his extensive career in the upstate, but others would add that some crimes don't have a statute of limitations.
Well, and you have to look through everything. I mean, I know that I personally look at a lot of stuff that never makes it to the light of day because maybe it's just not bulletproof enough to bring out and stand behind in public. But yeah, you're sifting through everything.
Right. And in fact, it's funny. I keep saying right. Some of the law enforcement officers out that way, they say we're right's a bad word now. We're going to start saying correct. So I'm having to correct myself because I say right all the time. I mean, hell, when he said if you're going to shoot somebody, shoot them the right way, WRIGHT. And here's what's so fascinating. Um, you do see some folks waking up to the fact that maybe they were lied to. It's not easy to admit you've been lied to. I mean, hell, we're all humans on this call. We've all been lied to. It was likely a hard pill to swallow, although some pills seem to be easier for Chuck to swallow. Uh, apropos of nothing. Um, when I, when I first read into Sheriff Chuck Wright, I'll be honest. On paper, I loved what I saw. And we're talking about a conservative sheriff who not only was big on Christian values, but on national issues. Somebody who encouraged people who were able to arm up, defend yourself. Somebody who picketed for limited government. I mean, this sounds like a constitutional sheriff if I've ever heard one. But once you just start looking at the credit card financials, once you start hearing what some deputies have been trying to say for decades, but what people refused to listen to because he was all those things that we listed out, um, it makes you wonder, did the media fail? Um, did some voters fail? Um, it,
I think
it,
it's
it,
really easy for both groups to fail. Like if you look at media, most you're looking at your TV markets and your major metropolitan areas. You're stuck with the same set of officials that you're going to need to go to get your stories and get information week after week after week. So if you are pissing off the county sheriff in the county that you need to report on, or the county council or whoever, it's not going to be long term something that is beneficial to you being able to do your job well or do your job easily. So
Mhm.
it's so easy for local media to let people slide. I think that's one of our greatest advantages as a statewide outlet is we can sit in Columbia and go report on folks in Myrtle Beach or in Spartanburg. And if we have problems with their office, as a result of that, so be it. But there's the whole rest of the state for us to report on.
And one thing I want to add to what you just said, Dylan. So as somebody who used to work in the clown show myself, I unfortunately observed that very same thing because remember, local mainstream media for the most part is more concerned with noise than news. They're more concerned with filling that news time in between their commercial breaks because that's what pays. Um, so yeah, when you shoot yourself in the foot and are no longer invited to press conferences with insert local law enforcement here, that inhibits your ability to fill that noise. Um, so yeah, as far as local news, especially local television, being the fourth pillar of democracy anymore, I mean, I think that pillar shattered decades ago. And if you need an example, look no further than the upstate region of North Carolina, where nobody has even reported on a federal grand jury being impaneled to talk about a nationally recognized sheriff, to weigh out evidence, hear testimony against a nationally recognized sheriff, Charles Chuck Wright Jr. Um, that's a failure. And I'd
And
go
you
as
ask
far
about the
as,
voters, I
mhm,
mean, if they don't have access to what is going on, you look at a sheriff's race in South Carolina, it's going to be determined in the primary, the Republican primary, especially in Spartanburg County.
mhm.
Chuck clearly has a lot of political allies. So is there anybody seriously who could challenge him? I know in Lexington County, the sheriff where I live, he is almost unassailable, and it doesn't sound like he's got problems like Chuck. It sounds
Mhm.
like he's unassailable because he's been there making relationships with people in the county for years, and anybody that would run against him would have a really hard time doing so successfully. But you can blame the voters, but also unless there is a real smoking gun, like say getting arrested by the feds, it's really hard for somebody who is an entrenched multi-term incumbent sheriff to be ousted.
And that, again, talking with another deputy the other night, um, it got a little teary-eyed talking about that because it took some people who have been in this fight literally for decades, it took them decades to finally unseat a sitting sheriff. Even though Chuck Wright is still technically the sheriff, on paper, he's still drawing a county paycheck. And fun little anecdote, around 2020, or at least financial records indicate that around 2020, he actually retired, only to come back and reap the benefits of retirement on top of his salary. At least 1 year indicates that. So there's more potential financial mismanagement, if you want to call that, or something that doesn't pass the smell test at a minimum. But yeah, you talk about just how bulletproof these sheriffs are. I mean, hell, in the county I used to live in, Richland. I mean, Leon Lott is a statewide household name. It's not just Richland County. Um, and I've got nothing negative to say about Leon Lott personally. I mean, he used to give me a hard time when I worked at WIS. He would come up to me asking if I needed recommendations on a barber and what hairspray I used. So from from one man with a strong hairline to another, I respect it, right? But Yeah, you're right. When the fourth pillar fails, where are the constituents who even care to read um, to get information that's worth making a cognizant decision on their elected officials? So we're going to keep diving into this. We're not going anywhere. I mean, when we've got reports, and we published this in our last headline, when we have indicators that there are financial ties to gambling, illegal gambling bosses and Sheriff Chuck Wright, it makes you want to dig deeper. Um, in an anecdote in our last report, uh, we quoted one deputy who talked about how when Chuck Wright was building his garage, which has some living spaces in it, he noted that there was metal being installed in the walls, at least in one corner. Whether or not the sheriff was installing a a magnificent gun safe or a bulletproof closet of sorts remains unclear. But nonetheless, there was reinforcements being installed into the wall. Um, and then years later, there is an indication that a gambling boss who was later charged by the sheriff's department had a financial hand in that garage being built. Now, all this is alleged and purported, but when when you hear what we plan to publish in the coming weeks or weeks, it puts a lot of things into focus about maybe some of the extracurricular activities of a sheriff who claims he is a Christian but does not appear to have prayed in a very long
Some need saving more than others, Andrew.
time. Hey, I don't profess to be a holy roller unlike Chuck. So there's the difference between him and me. That on top of I'm not government subsidized. So take it what you will. But I think that's the Spartanburg onion. It is a lot to unpeel. I feel like we haven't even got past the crusty layer, and
No, and I hope
already
that folks can appreciate when you're saying, we stay tuned for this stuff that we're going to be dropping. It's going to be huge. Like we're not. This is not a cliffhanger ending of an episode on a TV show. It's that we need to make sure that we let the story develop on its own. That we're not out here becoming the story.
right. And something that I added during our Hurricane Helene coverage, where we caught significant flack for reporting on what people were saying, which was that the body count was much larger than what the media still purports it to be. Um, there's a line that I had heard in listening to some of my podcasts, going through some of those areas, because I was on a Jordan Maxwell kick at that time, and he said something that just really hit me to my core. He said, don't trust the person who claims to have the facts, but instead listen to the person looking for the facts. That's what Fitz News is doing. That's also what our panel of deputies, our former and active lawmen, are doing. They don't claim to have the story, but they claim to be looking. That's what we're doing. That's what we have kind of entered into this magnificent partnership with these lawmen to achieve. And again, a lot of things are coming into focus. I hate to leave people on a cliffhanger, but we will get there hopefully very soon.
Well, thank you for that, Andrew.
Hey, man, I appreciate y'all letting me rant.
We didn't hear anything about the bad
Independent
apples or
media.
the orchard of justice.
Yeah, well, I know the analogy is, one bad apple or a tainted orchard, you decide. I mean, as Dick Harpootlian emphasized in an interview that we sat down with him on yesterday, what what was it? He was talking about maybe referring some cases out to some counties, right, Dylan?
Right.
And he said, there's paraphrasing, but there's all these competent counties we could refer cases to, like Richland, Greenville, Spartanburg. Well, maybe not Spartanburg. Um, Obviously that resonated with me, but
Well,
yeah,
and I will
no,
hype people up for that interview. That's going to be dropping early next week, and it was really fun. It was more than an hour. Dick has been a major player in South Carolina's legal and political communities for 50 years, and it was a wide-ranging conversation. We were not just talking about Alex Murdaugh for an hour and a half. Thank goodness. We talked about many of the interesting things that happened, that have happened in Dick's life, and I think folks are really going to enjoy it.
I did.
Yeah, it was great being there, and I'm looking forward to watching it again while I edit it.
There we go.
So,
I
Callie, it's
can't wait to
been
see
a
it.
big month in true crime. 1 year after the
Oh
passing
my.
of Micah Miller, more information about the death of Chris Skinner, and some clarity on Connor Lloyd as well, a case that we've been following. Do you want to begin by diving in on the 1 year Micah Miller anniversary?
Yeah, yeah, let's do. We're all waiting to see what the FBI is going to do, what they come up with after that search of the home of John Paul Miller on November the 1st of last year. And, there in the days leading up to this 1 year anniversary, I know there was great hope on the part of those who would like to see a prosecution that we would see something. And of course, we didn't. We're still waiting. Um, but we don't have any reason to believe that there has been a conclusion. So, still in that very much a waiting pattern. We've seen people look back over the past year in all kinds of different ways. And I think one of the things that was not immediately apparent to me about Micah's case, even though we cover this and we talk about it daily, is that at the same time we're covering Micah's case, there's also been this surgence of victims that have come forward who have suffered abuse at the hands of religious leaders. And they are feeling empowered. They're feeling empowered to tell their stories. That's now thousands of people. I had no idea. And it's tied to her impact. So I think that's kind of something wonderful that has come out of this. You know, we don't want to be so callous as to say she's in a better place and, you know, good things in the end, right? But I think it could be true in this case that something positive is coming out of what was a horribly tragic situation. And then also on that front, we've defined coercive control as the media in ways that have not been attempted before. I probably wasn't clear on the definition of coercive control a year ago, but we've learned it. We've seen it. We've talked to victims. We've talked to survivors. And now, finally, we have seen the introduction of Micah's Law in South Carolina. And Dylan, you know far more about the process there than I do with the legislature. And maybe you can help us understand that part. So, being introduced, is that a token measure? Does that get us anywhere? What do you
every
think?
every bill, big or small, that gets passed is always going to be introduced. That means that there is a member of the House or Senate, and not everything can be introduced in the House or Senate. Like, for example, a revenue generating bill cannot come in through the Senate, but a lot of different types of bills can come through both. Ideally, honestly, if you really want to get something passed, you will have somebody in both chambers introduce similar legislation so that it can move through both at the same time and then converge. But the introduction just means that somebody has decided that they're going to try to run this bill up the flagpole and get it passed. And so they will go to either the president or the Senate or the Speaker of the House with their bill, file it, and then that will be assigned to a committee where it begins the long process. A lot of bills will basically die in committee, is what it's called, where it will be assigned to a committee and it may never even be scheduled to get a hearing in that committee over the 2 year legislative session. So, right now, this bill being introduced at the back portion of the spring 2025 legislative session means that it has the other half of the 2025 legislative session, the fall session. It can advance then, and then all throughout 2026 there will be another spring, another fall. We in South Carolina operate on 2 year legislative sessions. So was this, I was looking to see if there was going to be any momentum for this to be an issue that sailed through and really had strong political backing uh, in the pre-filing period, which is before the session even starts. You can put bills in, and that will allow them to kind of be fast tracked so that the first day that legislators arrive in Columbia, they can start working on it. I think if there was a serious push that was really well organized, they would have found us multiple House sponsors, multiple Senate sponsors, and before they even came to Columbia this spring, they would have had it introduced. So is this performative? Is this a joke that has been introduced? No, not at all. We're only, less than a quarter of the way through the 2 year legislative session. But is this as serious of an effort as could have been put forth if they were able to engage some lobbying firm or had good political connections and were able to really push this like somebody that is genuinely trying to ram through something they're legislatively interested in. No, it's not that either.
See, that kind of hurts my heart because I feel like there is um, I don't even know if you call it a grassroots movement, but there's a reaction. There's a very strong reaction, and there's people who are not normally involved in the political process that would like to see some activity here. But I also sense a disconnect between that people and the of those people and the actual process. How do we how do we inform those people of how to engage in the political system that is foreign to them in a meaningful way that will see this through?
So, if you live in South Carolina, the first question, and you're interested in this or any bill, is do you know who your state senator and your state house representative are? You can go online and figure that out. The state has a website where you basically put in where you live, and it will tell you your house and Senate district on the election commission website. Once you figure that out, you can put both of their names into Google, go to their page on the State House website, and it will show contact information. It will show phone number and email. They it's rare on major pieces of legislation for them to receive 10 pieces of communication from the public. So if you reach out to them with an email, with a phone call, and maybe even get one of your friends, if you know somebody else who lives in their district, to do the same, that will definitely put it on their radar. Although, we feel like we're very small and have no impact, if you actually take the 5 minutes to reach out, it's really not hard. I mean, you could do this in 10 minutes and move about your day, but that could be the thing that takes this member, because you got to remember there's hundreds of bills filed. There's things that are dealing with the state's education system, that are dealing with the roads, that are dealing with energy production. These are not small issues. These representatives and senators' time is very valuable. So you need to make them realize that there is a political reason for them to care about a relatively small, social. This is not something that Google's spending, hundreds of thousands of dollars to put lobbyists down there lobbying for. And that's what you're competing for the attention of these legislators with. But the grassroots can actually be really powerful.
I'm glad to know that. I would be very sad to think that this could only happen if lobbyists were engaged, if professional politicians had to be the ones driving it. So if what I hear, if this is accurate, it's going to take directed movements, the attention of the people whose attention has already been captured. It's going to take some focus in a particular direction. In other words, they're going to have to be lobbyists. Is that correct?
I could conceivably also see the trial lawyer lobby hopping in and supporting this legislation, which, to be honest with you personally, I don't know if I agree with every line of it, and I think that it will probably have a hard time passing through the House and the Senate, because although this is something that folks may want to support, and I'm happy to tell them how to engage in the electoral process, I'm not going to delude anybody into thinking that this is not controversial legislation. This fundamentally changes the relationship between man and wife. It seriously alters the family court system. I mean, this is not something that's just going to sail through as some rinky-dink minor piece of legislation. If this were to actually move forward, this would be monumental.
Right.
There would be a lot of
And
debate
other states have done it.
in
Definitely.
countries.
And it's not against a lot of behavior, but we got to decide and define when that goes too far into criminality, perhaps. If a law like this is to go forward, I would think that's part of the process. And we don't want the government in our bedrooms or at our dinner tables dictating our behavior. It's a very thin line, and I can see where it would be tricky.
And I can understand. I'm looking at the legislation right now. I have it pulled up, and a lot of the stuff is already illegal. And what I was
Mhm.
doing when I wrote about this, because I actually wrote about this type of legislation more than a year ago now, is that how is it applied in the jurisdictions where this is already the law? And it seems like they're not going over the line, because it does scare me as a limited government person looking. If the judges were to allow this to get out of hand, this there's some pretty broad stuff in here where I think that anybody could, anybody dissatisfied with their marriage could probably find a couple of these categories to go bring a case. So then it really comes down to the state's judiciary to do the right thing. Unfortunately, my faith in the Palmetto State's family court judiciary is really low. I've just seen evidence time and time again doing this job that if you end up in the South Carolina family court system, you are in for a terrible time. Uh, so I don't know how much trust I'm willing to place in that institution.
Yeah, that we'll be talking about that with the Connor Lloyd case, of course. So thank you for your insight there, Dylan. I really appreciate that. So moving on to the Chris Skinner investigation, which has been reopened, and which it's our understanding that the coroner, excuse me, uh, has not yet completed her portion of the investigation. This was ruled an accident at the time of his death. And we've seen the video now. It's publicly available and has been publicly available for the first time within the past month. You can see in the video that that was no accident. There was no getting too close to the edge of the pool. It was a directed movement. It was intentional. I think that makes the question, was Chris in charge of the wheelchair? Was Chris coerced? Um, so then we have either a suicide or we have something more nefarious. And really, that's what is being, I'd say, looked at this point. Jen and I had a very nice interview with his sister, Tamara, and that'll be coming out within the next week. And we talk about a lot of elements of the case that we really haven't discussed before, some of the questions that she had. And I think it's important to note that she has really come under fire for asking questions about her brother's death. But let me remind you that there is no harm in asking questions. Of course, our crew, we do it every day. But if you have questions about something, especially about something this important, it is perfectly fine to ask questions until you get a satisfactory answer. And unfortunately, the family does not have a satisfactory answer. In fact, some of the elements of this case they were not aware of until after the death of Micah Francis Miller a year ago. Chris's death happened in 2021.
Yeah,
And
one of the
according
things that we
to
were talking
Allison
about
Williams,
one of the things we were talking about during the Micah 1 year anniversary roundtable conversation we recorded last week is how we just keep getting developments in this case. This is not like your average, let's look back at this thing that happened a year ago. I mean, this video became public
mhm,
within the last couple of weeks.
right, right. And another thing that has become public about this case within the past couple of weeks is that someone sent me a tip. And by the way, thank God for the tipsters involved with this whole scenario with Micah Francis Miller and with the Chris Skinner case. They don't let us miss a thing, and thank God for them. So, a tipster sent me a document I had not seen before, and it was basically a complaint made on the grounds of Chris not being allowed to use the pool that they were paid members for because the homeowners association wouldn't approve a method for him to use. They didn't want him to use assistance. They didn't want him to use his own gear. They didn't want to install gear. They didn't want him to use borrowed gear. They did not want him using the pool. So the Skinners launched this effort and prevailed, and the homeowners association was to install a lift that would make the pool accessible for him and anyone like him. So think about what a war that is and how difficult that is to fight if you're the person with the disability. And that's the place where he died. And also, you've got to consider Chris Skinner was a motivational speaker. His whole life was built around the concept of overcoming difficulties in our life, overcoming adversity, finding purpose, and prevailing. And so when he died, he does so at this fought for access to, and in a wheelchair that was provided to him by people who believed in his mission. It is, if If you think those things line up and they're consistent, maybe this is an intentional act that he did himself. I personally have a hard time getting those things to line up.
Well, and I think the other
And
thing that
I
you've
welcome
yet to
your
mention that
input.
is definitely eyebrow raising here is the DNR.
Oh, yes, right. When his wife arrived on the scene that day, on September the 6th, 2021, she rushed to the police. She did not rush to his side. Susie Skinner rushed to the police to inform them that Chris allegedly had a do not resuscitate order, which would essentially mean do not, no medical intervention, right? Leave him be. He did not want any medical intervention. So the police officer there said, "We're going to need that. Find it for us." She left the scene and went to find it, not just once. At one point, loaded in the ambulance, they are ready to leave. Now, remember here that when they retrieved him from the pool, he was still alive. He was not responsive, but he was still alive. So he's loaded into the ambulance, and the ambulance is held up for 7 minutes while she's looking for the DNR paperwork that was ultimately never provided. So he was taken to the hospital, and life saving efforts were administered, but he did not make it. I think that raises a lot of questions. Andy?
Yes, I have a question myself. Going back to the moment that 400 plus pound wheelchair goes into the pool. Um, I think you know me. I'm hardwired to play a devil's advocate, but on top of that, I am genuinely curious here. Um,
Hmm.
were there people around? Were there people nearby? I've watched the video. It seems to be a pretty empty pool ground, but if this thing is being triggered and he sees this going to the pool, I mean, is he is he capable of making distress signs? Obviously, there's no audio on the video, so we don't know if he's calling for help or anything, right?
Right. We don't know that. Um, he was not capable of a lot of movement.
Mm-hmm.
No, there wouldn't have been big hand gestures. I don't know if we would have been able to detect anything from the video at its best because it's so very far away.
Mm-hmm.
I I would like to know what his expression was because I do think that could perhaps tell us something about that incident. Um, but the fact is that particular model, as you mentioned, a 485-pound tank, uh, it's made to go in shallow water. It will go across all kinds of different terrain. But if you're under it, what are you going to do? It is, you can operate it by use of a remote, and they can be hacked
Mm-hmm.
without a lot of difficulty. Um, you can Google that and find out for yourself the results, because people have shown it, people have done it, and there will be more in the interview with Tamara about that because it had been mentioned
And
prior to
one,
Chris's death.
of course, going back to that video footage, because I mean that's a silver bullet. I mean, smoking gun if we know one. Um, did that camera record without audio, or was the audio removed?
I don't have any reason to believe that there was audio. And
Okay.
I don't think I answered your question. It was he had someone let him into the pool that day
Mm-hmm.
saying that he was going to meet someone to play chess. He was the only one there. He was the only one there for the better part of an hour until a water aerobics class arrived. And those are the people who called 911.
Mm. Mm. Now, obviously, something I piques my personal interest, not just only as a human being, but obviously as somebody who holds truth to power. And when you have this affiliation between Chris Skinner, I mean, this connection more so between Chris Skinner and this embattled pastor. Um, One thing and if I'm jumping around, definitely break check me, but this FBI probe into JP, do we know what the exact focus is from the feds' perspective?
We do not. We do
Mhm.
not. And of course, they can look into whatever they want to look into. I hope this is on their radar.
Hmm.
I would think it would be because, as Allison Williams has said, it is chilling to consider that Micah and Chris are now both gone, and JP and Susie are obviously together.
Right. Hmm.
Should we move on to the Connor Lloyd case, or does anyone have any questions about Chris or Micah?
I would just like to clarify one thing. I mean, some folks are kind of
Yeah.
speculating right now in the comments. Would he be brain dead at that point? Yes, he would. After having been not not getting oxygen in the pool for that long, it's surprising that he was even alive at that point.
Hmm. It is, right. Right.
I suppose
Even
one.
if
Mhm.
the 7-minute wait hadn't happened, the chances of recovering him, that it's
Virtually
bleak.
none.
Right.
Mhm.
Right.
So yeah,
And
I
So,
suppose we should move on to Connor
okay,
Lloyd.
so all right. This was a cold case. And then all of a sudden we had 3 arrests. Boom, boom, boom. And they're very strange how the way this all came about. So Connor Lloyd was murdered on August the 18th of 2021, 2 days before he was to have his first overnight visit with his infant daughter. And the reason I mention that is because it may end up to be related to the motive for the murder in this case. The people who have been arrested are the mother of that child, Kendra Lee Wilson, her mother, Cynthia Wilson, and the third arrest was the person thought to be the hired gunman, Douglas Gilbert. And it is also understanding from people who know Kendra that since her capture in early April, she has admitted that she hired Douglas Gilbert to kill Connor. So her escape to the Netherlands is a whole nother situation that brings to mind John Mello, actually. And Dylan, I know you were up there. You've talked to John Mello. You've covered the Rose Petal murder case. Um, he felt it necessary to leave the country with his daughter because he had made 2 years of calls to DSS, concerned that his daughter was being abused, and those complaints were not taken very seriously. Is that a fair way to say that, Dylan?
I think that's how John would say it, and I do think that there's a lot of truth to that. Now, did he make those complaints in a way that was rational and calm and what that somebody at DSS would think they're dealing with a rational actor? I don't know, but he certainly made complaints, and there certainly was some veracity to them.
Yeah. And although we did not know it until after the death of Christina Parcell, he was right. The daughter was being abused. And the evidence of that was found as they were investigating Christina's death. So here we have another situation where a young mother is reporting things, instances of abuse that she clearly believes. She does not think she's being taken seriously. She is being made to share custody of this daughter. So she flees the country. And at the time, many news organizations framed this as her fleeing the country to avoid arrest for murder. But she did not know at that point that she was going to be arrested. The case had sat cold for 4 years. So when she left the country, the Netherlands, and it's particularly telling about where she went, the Netherlands has a policy on the handling of people who are fleeing abuse, especially mothers and children. They shield them. Had she not been wanted for murder, it is unlikely she would have been deported. They were already extending supportive services to her based on the disclosures given during the time that she was there. So it's much more the murder investigation. And I I don't we have to take something from the fact that we have these two very, very different individuals, Kendra Wilson and John Mello, who both felt it necessary to leave the country to protect their children.
And both
And
had
here
third
is where it
parties do
gets
the
into the
dirty
family
work.
court system. Yes, that's a very good point too. Very good point.
Do we know what led law enforcement to make this breakthrough on this case after it sat cold for so long?
We don't. I'm looking forward to finding out, but they have said very little. And so far, the three remaining, they're still being held in Spartanburg. I would think we would, well, we'll have to find out before too long because the process will move forward. The charges will go to trial or someone will make a deal. But I would think we will find out someday. But right now, we have no idea.
Well, I suspect that this is a story that we will cover in future episodes of the month in review. This is now not the first time that a case that we've covered that is completely cold has come to life and that we found new information. And I look forward to seeing what we hear next. You just spoke about taking a deal. I actually have a story that I know that you've been involved with prior to your affiliation with Fitz News, and that's the story of Russell Lafitte, who took a federal plea deal this month. I covered Lafitte's first trial in 2022. He was found guilty of 6 financial crime charges associated with his business dealings with Alex Murdaugh. For folks that are unfamiliar with Murdaugh, he was a Hampton County, South Carolina plaintiff's lawyer, and he was convicted, of course, on the world stage on the most viewed trial in court TV history of killing his wife and son. But what the state alleges was his motive for doing that is that he was caught committing millions of dollars of financial crimes. And he's had a couple of co-conspirators go down with him. One of his best friends, who is also an attorney, Corey Fleming, and his longtime friend, Russell Lafitte. Uh, Alex Murdaugh's dad was Russell Lafitte's godfather. Russell Lafitte's dad was Alex's godfather. So these two grew up together and were, as they say, thick as thieves. And unfortunately, when Alex was getting these plaintiff's lawyer settlements from some clients who he knew were not sophisticated enough to know exactly how much money was coming their way, he would divert some of those funds for his own use. And Russell Lafitte has now admitted to helping him do so and to inappropriately writing a check to try to make it all go away, a more than $500,000 check, when it was time to face the music. Now, Russell Lafitte, covering his first trial, I thought it was idiotic that he even took it to trial because the state had so much evidence, because this is a financial crime where you just everything is documented in the banking system because it's all done electronically. So you can go keystroke by keystroke and track these checks. And obviously, this is something that if you're Russell Lafitte, you're banking on this just never seeing the light of day. But by the time the feds arrive and they take that evidence, he would have been wise to do what Corey Fleming did, which was understand that the feds have a greater than 95% conviction rate, and that if you cut a deal, you're going to get less time in prison. Now, it took him going to trial and losing. And now he did ultimately have that verdict overturned by the Court of Appeals because there was basically a civil rights issue with a juror being removed for a medical issue, which at the time his lawyers didn't even object to. As somebody who was, there in the courtroom covering the proceedings, it didn't seem objectionable to any of the parties. The defendant, the prosecution didn't seem concerned that it was going to ruin the case. But the Court of Appeals, to preserve his rights, ruled that he was entitled to a new trial. And he elected, instead of taking it to another trial, to cut a plea deal. Now, he still faces state charges. That was not a part of the plea deal. He's still scheduled to go to trial on charges stemming from an Allendale County fraud charge. It'll be interesting to see if he's working to cut a deal, behind the scenes with state authorities. And if they want to give him one, they could, of course, elect to not give him a plea deal and take it to trial and try to beat him in court. But he will receive just over $3.5 million of restitution payments. He's going to have to sell his assets, his land, to make these payments, and he's going to receive a 5-year sentence, and they will subtract the time he's already served, which is a year and some change from that. So he will return to federal prison for 3 years and change. Callie, I'm sorry, Andrew, I'll get to you one second. But Callie, what was your experience with this case back in 2022 before we worked together?
Oh, that's very funny that you would bring that up. I had just started working for the Murdaugh Murders podcast right before that trial began. So this was my trial by fire, getting into the whole world of the Murdaugh Empire and all that was to follow. What a fascinating case, and also what an adventure this whole thing has been. um, yeah, that I guess I never thought Lafitte really had a chance, and like you, I wondered why would he go that far. He's been through multiple sets of attorneys, and
And very good
didn't he end
attorneys as well,
up with
expensive
Sean?
attorneys.
Yes, the best of the best. Didn't he end up with Sean Kent?
He currently is
Is that
retaining Sean
correct?
Kenton. Yeah.
Okay. And I have a fascination for that attorney. Brilliant.
Hmm.
He's brilliant. Um,
But the best
not that there
legal
are a
minds
lot
in the
of
world
brilliant
can't save
attorneys,
you
but
when you've done crimes that are so well documented.
exactly. They might be able to get you a better deal, but they can't save you from prosecution.
And I think his attorneys did get him a
It's
good deal.
interesting how this is. Yeah.
And that's actually something I want to talk about with you, Andrew. But what did you want to ask before we get to that?
Yeah, I suppose I've got a question for the experts over here, because you know, when the Murdaugh murder saga was continuing, and you know, as the trial was happening, I was working at a completely different outlet. You know, it's funny. I think we all have the "Where were we the day Alec got sentenced" story. You know, I remember I was watching it live in my WIS squad car in Newberry, and I had just talked to the mayor out that way about, you know, what's going to happen. What do we expect here? And we were all expecting Homeboy to get off. Um,
Almost
so
did.
almost, well, so close, right? So the question I had for the experts here was, okay, yes, the evidence is well documented, and clearly it's beyond a reasonable doubt because he's been found guilty, I guess, twice now at this point. But had it not been for this international audience behind the Murdaugh murders, do you think authorities would still have come down on him as hard as they did? Would him and Fleming be looking at the jail time that they're currently facing again, had it not been for this international interest?
If it weren't for Alex basically screwing it all up by being an addict, I think that was where it all fell apart. I think these guys would have successfully continued to run these schemes. If Alex was not addicted to, I think he was addicted to gambling. I've heard a lot of people talking about him going to these poker games where you can lose six figures in a night easily. And folks also talking about how his pecuniary problems, given how much money he made no sense, even if he was using all the drugs in the world. I strongly believe that there was a link between the gambling and his financial ruin, um, which put so much pressure on their little fraud scheme that it all fell apart. So, do I think that without Alex, this would have ever even been discovered? No, these guys were keeping it small time enough that I think that they could have gotten away with it potentially, and you know, until they wanted to stop taking the risk of committing financial crimes and walk away from the table with their winnings. I think that this is happening throughout the state right now. All sorts of people in positions of trust are abusing their power and never got caught. But let's say, for the sake of this hypothetical for your question, they did get caught. If you look, I know I'm on the United States Attorney press release list. When they do catch somebody abusing power like this, they usually bring the hammer down on them. If it's somebody who is entrusted uh, with extra levels of power in our society, as bankers are, as lawyers are, we trust them to behave as fiduciaries, which means that they are appropriately acting with other people's resources. And we drop the hammer when people who should be acting as fiduciaries don't.
Mm-hmm. So you're
As we
saying
should.
so you're saying that if Alec had not, according to the courts, used multiple firearms to kill his wife and child, then these boys might still be doing exactly what they were doing.
Yes, and I would go so
I
far as,
think.
Mm-hmm.
sorry, Callie, but I
No,
would
no.
go, yes,
You,
Doris in the comments says, if not for the boat wreck, if it wasn't for Alex unraveling the whole scheme, I think that it would still be operating. And I think that there's no way that these are the only two other professionals which knew about and aided and abetted in his schemes. And I think that there are probably other folks who are still operating in the courts, in the financial institutions in that part of the state who are clenching their butt cheeks until this is 15 years in the rearview mirror.
Right.
Yeah.
Keep clenching, because
There was a
if we
boat
can
wreck.
find evidence of it,
Right.
we'll blow you out of the water.
Yeah. There was the boat wreck. There was the murders of his wife and child. But I think the tipping point was that roadside, not a shooting, when he simply had gone so far off the rails that there was no recovering. Because until then, I think maybe a lot of this would have been handled through backroom deals. That's just my opinion of it.
I was working at the Attorney General's office at the time, and you got to remember that these cases are very compartmentalized. So it's not like I'm in here with, Creighton Waters and Don Zelenka and the key decision makers. I'm just doing my little communications roll up in the top office, helping out when WIS needs somebody to bring them in the door and get them set up for their interview, right? But of course, you still get the atmosphere. And yes, the roadside shooting among all of us, employees who, of course, had nothing to do with the case, but we're still discussing it because it's the most interesting thing happening in the state at the time. We're just like dumbfounded by the roadside shooting. And of course, we're like, well, like, I guess we're going to have to do something now. What that will end up being, we didn't know at that time, but that was certainly a turning point. You correctly identified that.
Fascinating case. Probably always will be. In fact, when I texted my mother that I had that job, just so she's not a true crime follower, not at all. Doesn't like it. Doesn't no, stays clear, far away from it. Her response was not good for you. Her response was, I think you spelled his name wrong.
Had you?
Yes, I had, but I didn't.
Well, that's so funny because my mom also does spell check duties for me. Oftentimes I'll publish an article and get, with
Yeah,
the little circled incorrect word texted to me within 5 minutes. And I
yeah,
love her for it.
yeah.
You
I
know,
was just all excited. I was like, Mom, got a job. It's blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So she had been following the case enough to know that that is not how you spell his name. I just
Will
found
is
it
a
very
good editor, but I
fascinating
think that my mom might be a better copy editor.
oh, yes, moms are brutal copy editors for sure.
So, Andrew, you see a lot of these cases, and we were talking about this yesterday, how there's a lot of similarity in the abuse of trust of society in general between the cases that you work, which are mostly law enforcement people who are given a position of elevated trust. When you become a sworn officer, a law enforcement officer, is much like becoming an officer of the court, or much like becoming an executive at a banking institution. In all three of those situations, you have the power to dramatically alter people's lives for the worst if you act unethically.
Mm-hmm.
I look at the outcome of a case like this, where Russell Lafitte, at the end of the day, is not going to jail for a very long time. I mean, he's already been there for a year and some change, and he's going to go for another 3 and some change. But I still kind of look at this and think this is a fair outcome because he will no longer be able to practice in the family business, which is kind of the only way he's made money his whole adult life. He's probably will end up spending close to $1 million on lawyers when this is all said and done. If he hasn't already crossed the 7-figure mark, he's going to have to liquidate significant assets to make $3.5 million of restitution payment. So, but at the same time, we see folks do some stupid petty crime and they'll go away for close to 10 years. Do you look at this and see this as a case that is resolved fairly? Do you think that this scares other people in Russell Lafitte's situation, similar and similar situations to Russell, where they might be doing something illegal to maybe stop? Does this have a deterrent effect?
I hear your question, and I'm applying it to 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 my perspective, to my frame of reference, being law enforcement, definitely heavy on law enforcement. This idea that just because you carry a badge and a gun, or just because you're elected to a county or town council position, that you're suddenly honorable and to be trusted with every word you say. Just as a constituent of Chuck Wright said, he might profess to being a holy man, but he's still a man. um, what I find so unfortunate, especially in reporting on a multitude of law enforcement officers going bad, our badges gone bad on a sometimes a daily basis, depending on what cases SLED wants to get wiped off their desk that particular week. Um, I'm always appalled by how few people care, how few people care that a lieutenant was recorded admitting to having his hands around his wife's neck. Although it appears as though in the case of Daryl J. Kicklighter, there might be some updates today. When you see sergeants stealing from the evidence room to pay for hot water heater installments, it appears as though, and this is a line that I heard from our panel of folks making our Chuck Wright saga possible. We live in an I, me, my world where if it doesn't personally touch me, it didn't happen. How do we change that? Do we change that with more legislation? Do we change that with informative journalism? Well, we've got it here at Fitz News. So how do we change the people? How do we move the voters? Because it's the court of public opinion that leads to any change and any reform, I would say, at the end of the day. Yeah, the feds could come in and pop you with however many indictments you want. But if the public doesn't care, nothing's going to happen. So going back to your question, how do we inform people that those in a position of power and trust sometimes are blinded with the 3 Ps? The 3 Ps: pay, power, and play. I know I'm answering your question with a question, but that's just something to think about.
Well, the thing that really bothered me at Lafitte's trial was not that he did this wrong thing. As you say, we're all men, just like the Chuck Wright case. I think if you are any student of Christianity, you'll know that the whole point is that all people are flawed. That's a kind of a key Christian takeaway that apparently the sheriff has missed there. But what really, it doesn't bother me when one person fails. What bothered me about that trial was that multiple members of the bank's board, which happened to be members of Lafitte's family because this is a closely held private bank, testified. They certainly did not renounce what had happened, and they even justified some of it as being appropriate in their testimony. And to me, if I'm a federal banking regulator, that's the kind of thing that I look at and say, because you got to remember, this bank, before the Lafitte family owned it, was forced to be sold to by federal authorities because a similar incident had happened before. And so walking away from that trial, my takeaway was like, okay, yeah, we got Russell, but we now also have hundreds of pages of on the record, sworn statements by other board members of this bank indicating that they believe that behavior that is wildly inappropriate for a financial institution is okay because that's just how they do business in Hampton. Which when you're a federally insured bank, you don't get to say, well, I've known him for a long time, so we're going to not record taking loans out of somebody's account that I'm a custodian for that they don't know about and not pay any interest, when really, if I was a fiduciary, I'd be investing that money in something earning the best returns that I could without taking serious risk. I mean, it was just completely inappropriate, and they didn't want to throw Russell under the bus, which is why I say they should have just taken the plea so they didn't have to put all this stuff on the record. But to me, I think Russell as an individual has been thoroughly dragged through the mud. But what disturbs me is that I haven't seen any evidence. If the FDIC looks at their practices and says it's okay, at the end of the day, we believe that there's enough risk control here that the family can't do anything else inappropriate. That's fine. But I've seen no evidence that they've even poked around there. And if anybody has that evidence, Dylan, DYLN, fitsnews.com, shoot me an email. I'd love to learn about that aspect. But it also takes me back to the CPA at the Murdaugh's law firm. The testimony that I heard at Alex's trial, man, she missed a lot. Now, I'm not saying that she knew about the things and ignored them, but also at what point of incompetency do we review whether you're deserving of your professional license?
Right. And another note there, we talk about justice. That seems to be the recurring theme, the underlying theme in this conversation here. And, even if we don't see additional cohorts dragged through the mud like Lafitte and others have, I suppose if it's any consolation, it's knowing that some people who might be living very comfortable lives on paper are shaking in their boots. While we might never know their names, it is reassuring to know that some people, hopefully, are petrified at what could come out. So, not the classical sense of justice. And, on the Murdaugh saga, you know, Walterboro, Carleton County, um, international interest. Like the fact that people in France can
Right.
point to a map and say that's where Carleton County is. That's amazing,
Right.
right? But something I always like to remind people of is, all right, we got one county. There's 45 more to go in South Carolina.
Yes, and that's
Right.
why I think that you talk about the deterrent effect. You're not going to get to catch every Russell Lafitte in this state. There's tons of podunk little banks with families running them that have run them for 60 years that are probably not following the rules to a T.
Mm-hmm.
But for our society to function, you need to be able to have the police on balance do the right thing. You need to be able to work with the lawyer and be able to truly trust them and know that they're not going to fleece you, or be able to put your money in a bank and know that it's not going to be getting loaned out without your knowledge. So justice, it's not about eye for an eye. Oh, Russell Lafitte, big bad guy, throw him in prison. Forget where you put the key. It's just, what do we need to do to set our society up such that we can have these institutions which allow us to do the things. I don't particularly care about banking. I just want my bank to be a faithful and true custodian of my money so I can do the things that I'm good at. I don't care about the law. If I need to interface with a lawyer, I would like to have society work such that I can confidently say that if I have to put money in the escrow, they're not going to walk away with it, and I'm never going to get to the bottom of what happened. Because if we don't have those things, this state will truly be a third world state where you can't really do any business.
Right. We might have a third
True, but
world's.
also,
Oh, sorry. Don't let me cut you off.
no, no, you go, Andy. You go first.
Okay, yeah, I was just going to add that, too, it'd be awful if we live in a third world state where law enforcement answers to private dark money enterprises, potentially illegal enterprises, all the while charging people for crimes that they themselves are committing. That would be awful if that existed here in South Carolina.
Well, and I think that's why the Murdaugh case blew up the way it did, because it brought together almost all of the themes that we've talked about in separate stories in this hour plus episode at this point. It weaved them all into one crazy and compelling tale.
Right, and I
It did.
guess that's just why that
Let's.
international interest. I'm sorry, I keep cutting you off. I'm gonna mute my
It's
microphone,
okay. That's
Callie.
okay. That's all right. I should do what you do and hold my hand up. My turn. Um, let's finish the job though. We only prosecuted a few. We know there are other people that were involved. There were judges, for instance, who looked the other way on these settlement agreements and allowed them to go through. There are other people who've been implicated. And then we have Becky Hill messing with the trial. Are we going to finish the job to send the right message that corruption's not okay and we're not going to tolerate it? Because I haven't seen that yet.
Yeah, I think there might be some gaming of the timing on that prosecution so that they don't mess up their appeals case. I mean, obviously we've talked about that multiple times, but I can't think of another good reason to just keep kicking that can down the road. The interesting thing is the
Yeah.
state
Isn't
keeps
that another
kicking the
form,
can of
though?
the appeal down the road, which means that they're going to have to continue kicking the can of Becky's prosecution down the road. You would think that if they were concerned about this case, a judge saying, look, we're going to have to bring this to trial. She's been on the docket for X amount of days. They would want to get that appeal before the Supreme Court sooner rather than later. But clearly, there's been some strategic decision made by the top prosecutors over at the Attorney General's office to delay the appeal as much as possible. There's one more
What bothers
story
me
I would.
about that is that it looks like this, it looks like the same things are happening that allowed the corruption to flourish. And I'm not saying that the people in charge are involved in corruption. I'm just saying if you're looking at if you're looking at the machinations of justice, this is how we got here.
It certainly is not a good
I'm
look.
sorry.
So
No,
there's
it's
one
not.
more big issue which I would like to touch on before we conclude the show here, and that is the case of State Treasurer Curtis Loftus. This has been a recurring story on Fitz News for more than a year. There was a discovery of a $1.8 billion accounting error at this point more than a year ago. And at the time of its publicization, it had actually been something that state officials in both the Comptroller General, which is like the state accountant's office, and the state treasurer's office, which are the folks who remit payments to the various people to whom the state owes money. They had known about this, but it kind of broke, and we reported missing $1.8 billion. And when this first broke, we thought it was actually $1.8 billion of cash that were gone. So this was a huge deal. And then the story developed, and it's $1.8 billion recovered. And Will went on a crusade because he was convinced that the tax and spend General Assembly were going to immediately spend the $1.8 billion. And, you talked to members of the General Assembly, they thought it was real cash at that time, too. So they were already making plans to spend it. But Will was going on a crusade basically asking that it be given back to the taxpayers in the form of tax relief. And it actually would have been a substantial amount of money per taxpaying household. However, we subsequently learned this was an accounting error. This was a paper error. This money never existed. So it was basically the state migrating from its old record-keeping system to its new SCEIS, as they call it, ERP, or Enterprise Resource Planning system. And when they had migrated one of the old accounts over, there was something that they set up in the computer system that was doing an incorrect journal entry. And this was repeated thousands of times, hundreds of times, I'm not sure exactly, but many, many times over the course of time before it was noticed. And this resulted in the accumulation of this $1.8 billion false account balance. Now, this is something that the state's accountant resigned over almost immediately, very shortly after it was discovered, because it became clear that the Senate was going to go after somebody and destroy somebody over this. And I think it was wise that he stepped out of the way, because it was most definitely his office's mistake. And it was something that seemed preventable, or at least something that should have been noticed before it had accumulated into such a large accounting error. That being said, with him out of the way, the only target left really for legislators looking to pin somebody's scalp up on the wall for this is Curtis Loftus. And in my investigation of this case, I believe that, I know that people at his office knew about this accounting error. This is something that went on for more than one audit cycle of the state. So this is something that the state's independent auditors would have had to have seen. But if you listen to Curtis, it never got raised to his attention until around the time that it became public. Now, Curtis was brought in front of multiple Senate subcommittees, and it got very contentious. There are the senators leading those committees, Curtis and his allies will say, are trying to aggregate as much power into their own hands as possible. And I think you look at the history of who has really wielded the power in this state, who is responsible for the successes and failures of the state. Well, the Senate Finance Committee chairman, that is one of the most powerful positions in the government of the state of South Carolina. And if they can control the treasurer, at that point, they would have near total power. But what I appreciated that this group did was commissioned the renowned accounting firm Alex Partners to prepare a report where they basically said, look into this error and tell us what the treasurer's office did wrong. So they kind of sent Alex Partners down this road looking and pointed them towards Curtis's office. And I found it very interesting because I read this whole report as I prepared my coverage of Curtis's big hearing before the South Carolina Senate. And it's a long report, but they have 25 takeaways at the end. And 3 of them are directed towards Curtis's office, towards the office of the treasurer, with the remaining being directed towards the state's accountant, the one who is really directly responsible for this. And so I would, I agree. There are things that those 2 offices need to improve. There certainly are things that Curtis's office should have done better in this situation. But to me, this is not a situation where it's clear that his office was egregiously mishandling the situation. That being said, he went before the Senate and he was testifying all day in something of a trial. Unfortunately, there's no evidentiary rules like there would be if you or I were brought to court, where we could have witnesses come in our defense or swear in documents, or even have the people who are accusing us of wrongdoing have to put their hand on the Bible and swear the same oath that you do as the accused when you're responding to those accusations. So it was kind of a lopsided proceeding. And there certainly were some disturbing things brought up about how did Curtis not know about this? I mean, why did his staff not run this up the flagpole so that he could go to the Senate and say, look, we have this accounting error? Because they were really not happy that they didn't know. And I can understand if I was a state senator and I felt like you were intentionally misleading me and not telling me about this potential problem, I would not be thrilled. But no state legislative body in the history of the country that I could find has voted to remove an elected official. And it should be mentioned that Curtis has won office 4 times at this point, and handily so. If you talk to voters, which I am lucky to be able to do a lot as I do political coverage, he's one of the most well-liked political officials in this state. To me, when we're so close to having another primary election, obviously the 2026 election, which is going to have an election for the treasurer, for the governor, for the attorney general, that's right around the corner. And the primary elections for those obviously precede the general elections. And in South Carolina, all of those officials will be Republicans. So the Republican primary is really where your election is. That's right around the corner. To me, it seemed like the Senate got a little bit out over their skis by going on this crusade against Curtis right before this primary election, because the voters are going to get to decide whether this behavior was appropriate or not. And we were actually lucky enough to have Curtis in our studio when he announced that he's running again, live on our air. Callie, Andrew, I think I've kind of adequately described the situation and Curtis's role in it, but also not his overwhelming guilt in it. This is the first time that we've seen a legislative body do anything like this. Am I crazy for having this kind of be an eyebrow raised moment for me as to the Senate taking this pretty extraordinary measure given the nature of the circumstance? Hit it,
Sounds like
Fancher.
someone's gunning for him.
Yeah, didn't want to step over anybody's toes here. So I did have a follow-up question here. We're not going to say that politics doesn't play a role in politics. Loftus, is his political affiliations, are they widely publicized? And furthermore, does it even matter what his political affiliations are at this point? Like, this wasn't anything retaliatory. What do you think?
Oh, no, it definitely matters. Curtis has been raising hell with and making life hard for these Senate power brokers for like the last 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So this is definitely them waiting in the tall grass, and he has made himself a problem for these people in the past. He is an outspoken conservative, and he is one of the only people in the state who is directly elected by the voters. So he doesn't have to play the Senate's, kiss ass for 15 years to get on the key committee appointment game. So when he sees them doing things which are inappropriate, if you look in the Senate, you see these guys will put in their 15, 20 years. And when they get to the top, they're cutting the contracts to their buddies. They're getting things in their district, which neglect the rest of the state.
Mm-hmm.
Look at the Hugh Leatherman terminal, drive down to Charleston. That's the guy who was running the show down there in the Senate Finance Committee. Insanely powerful politician. He made himself a thorn in those guys' side. And this is, I believe, mostly payback for that more than it is legitimately about his guilt in this situation.
So if what you're telling me about all this is true about Loftus, I suppose the question to you, does it surprise you that this is the final recourse?
I did not expect them to go this far. I don't know if the Senate leadership expect the House to go along with it. See, because as it's written in our Constitution, this has to be voted on by both the House and the Senate before he can be expelled from office. From what I've heard talking to members of the House, there does not seem to be political appetite right now to do that. That being said, if there's significant leverage in horse trading, I want to get this bill passed. You guys want to see Curtis gone. Curtis could end up on the chopping block. He's still in a really bad spot here, even if he does have strong allies in the House, because he's now reliant on them to not put him in that position where they could potentially conclude these proceedings and try to find him guilty in the House as well.
And it's not like Curtis doesn't know where the filing cabinets are. I mean, do you suspect he might have some power play at hand here, or I mean, what's next for Loftus, both just in the current position as well as just kind of his future role in politics, or is he donezo?
Oh, I think if you're counting Curtis out for winning re-election, you're a fool. I mean, this guy has name recognition like nobody else in a treasurer's race will. If you've lived in South Carolina, I mean, he's been the treasurer the whole time I've lived in this state.
Right.
I think he's going to be hard to beat. And you go to these GOP grassroots events, which Curtis, he does what every good statewide politician should do, which is spend plenty of time in your car driving around the state and talking to people at local level. They love him. They love him. So yeah, what is Curtis's political future? I think that he will actually use this to boost him and play the outside. Playing the outside in politics is one of the quickest ways to rise to the top, which is basically saying, look at what my own party's doing. They're wrong. I mean, look at what drove Bill Clinton to his presidential success. He said, oh, this welfare, these key parts of the Democrat platform at that time, that's wrong. We're not doing that. That's what Nancy Mace is attempting to do right now with the South Carolina GOP. Slamming Alan Wilson repeatedly, slamming Pam Abbott. She's attempting to point in at her party and say what they're doing is wrong. Look at Donald Trump. He eviscerated the Republican Party as it existed in 2016. These are all, well, not Nancy. We'll see how that plays out. But, Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, they're great examples of how coming in from the outside in politics can actually be really powerful in slamming your own party. And so if Curtis plays his cards right, and I've seen him, he's an effective political operator. I've seen him address crowds. I've seen him work crowds, one-to-one, and I've seen him talk to them as a room. He's really good at doing both of those things. And I think that this actually might energize his campaign and allow him to have an easier time when it comes to appealing to the voters directly, because the reality is that the folks that are waging this war against him are the swamp. I mean, he can credibly make that case. Now, are some of them good, well-intentioned people that I would love to have in this studio and have an informed conversation with? Sure. But also, by the time that you rise to that level of power in the Senate, it is what it is.
Right. Well, I suppose the question that we could pose in every one of the cases that we've discussed here today, whether it be Chuck, JP, Skinner, potentially even Lloyd, as well as Lafitte, state treasurer, is kind of this Latin line that I always like going back to. Cui bono, who benefits? There's something to think about.
That is actually one of the biggest things I thought about in this story, because I don't see where Curtis would benefit from not disclosing this accounting error. I mean, he didn't make the problem. It was the state's accountant that made the accounting error. It's not like he was covering up his own tracks. It's not like he had any financial interest in this. I mean, this was $1 billion that were quite literally not real. Who benefits here? Maybe some state senators by getting to peg a scalp on the wall and have somebody who's a perennial thorn in their side be removed from the South Carolina political scene. But I don't see Curtis benefiting. And I looked. And if I did, I would be jumping down his throat just like everybody else. But I think not taking everything at face value here might be wise, and really looking into exactly what you're saying. Did Curtis benefit? I don't know that he did. I don't know that he had any incentive to cover this up.
Well, I'm curious to see what he does next. Like you said, he could totally use this to his advantage. I mean, I think we have got a dashboard of cases that just me, not only as a writer of sorts, but just personally am fascinated to see what happens next, whether it be in the political realm, the true crime realm, the corruption, which I think falls into both of those categories realm. And we've got it all right here in South Carolina, right here at Fitz News. And as you are well aware, Dylan, I follow a ton of local mainstream media because I try and find something redeemable in them. But, I'm not just saying it because I get a paycheck from here. Fitz News really is doing it like nobody else. I mean, I think we bring the most informative reports to the table. I think if anyone wants to have or normalize a conversation, this would be the platform for that. Otherwise, you'll be following local TV thinking that the 1.8 billion was real, which was my problem. It wasn't until I read your report, Dylan, that I found out it wasn't even real. So there's my test.
Well, I always start my reporting process by reading what the mainstream has put out on the topic. And oftentimes I will be surprised as I then dig farther than that to see that there was a key element of the story which was missing from the mainstream coverage. And that's usually what I ended up trying to highlight just to balance out the public media ecosystem on the story.
Well, it's funny just, comparing and contrasting MSM and our reports, where MSM, the entire body of their article is about as long as our headline. It's pathetic, man. But what can you do? You can normalize the conversation. You can lead a horse to water. We got the water over here, y'all. Come take a drink.
Yes. Thank you to everybody who supports us to be able to do this.
We are
this is
fortunate to work for independent media.
Right.
Yes. This is fitsnews.com I think there are probably people who are watching this on YouTube or X right now who have never actually been to our website, but this is what allows us to do this kind of reporting that you guys might see on YouTube or X on a weekly basis. This is fitsnews.com. You can visit it on your web browser, visit it on your cell phone. And of course, if you subscribe to this website, it's $8 a month, but that's what pays our salaries. This is what it lets us do this investigative work, to dig beyond the normal headlines of your mainstream media coverage. So we appreciate that greatly. Thank you, everybody who's been with us throughout this live show. Thank you, Callie and Andy, for joining me and holding down the fort in the absence of our fearless leader. We'll see you all next week for the Week in Review.